Hello everyone, my name is Kozen Kanji. I'm the editor of VOD Professional. Welcome to OTT Question Time. This week we are talking about the environmental impact of OTT streaming. It's a complex, multifaceted issue, and joining me on the panel to discuss this are, if we can start with Luke.
So hi, I'm Luke Gaydon. I am the co-founder of TerraNutra. TerraNutra is a company that helps people manage their carbon footprint, which obviously is quite relevant to this topic. I also spent about 15 years in the video streaming space, working for a couple of different technology companies, so kind of have that perspective on this question as well.
Thank you very much. Gulliver.
Hi, I'm Gulliver Smithers. I'm CTO for a company called RampRate that help people sort out their supply chains. And our big focus this year is looking at sustainable supply chains and corporate social responsibility. So relevant there. My background is also in VOD, having spent 10 or 12 years entertaining people with various products laterally in the US, where I spent about 4 years working on direct-to-consumer products here.
Thanks, Gulliver. Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria Ingold, and I've been deploying emerging visual technology for almost 30 years now. So I'm the former CTO of a Disney-Sony joint venture. I built one of the most successful early video-on-demand movie services in Europe. And that was profitable, which is still kind of unheard of. But I've been taking that kind of entrepreneurial thinking and consulting for the last 8 years. And as part of that, one of the companies I'm working with as a board advisor is iSize, and they provide pre-coding, machine learning pre-coding that reduces bit rate while maintaining or improving perceptual optimization.
Chunky. Good. And Lars, finally to you.
Thanks. So I'm Lars Larsson. I'm CEO of Varnish Software. We are a software company who builds content delivery solutions for websites, for video streaming, and we're also providing solutions for building CDN. So a lot of the big streaming companies are our customers. We're also the company behind open source product called Varnish Cache, which is quite big in the web performance space. We power approximately 8.6 million websites. So we have been around this business for almost 10 years now.
Thank you very much. And why are you on the panel, Lars?
I think building content delivery solutions that are sustainable is very important for the environment. And that's something that's become more and more important for us as a company to help streaming providers to provide sustainable solutions that can deliver more with much less energy and less carbon footprint.
Great, thank you very much. And Maria, just to say as well that you're also on the panel because of an article that you wrote just last month, yeah?
Yes. So I've been writing a couple of articles following COVID-19 about the change that's been happening in the industry, so that we are streaming more, we're streaming more from home, and the request by the EU to essentially say, could you reduce the bit rates by 25%, and how we can do that in a way that's more sustainable going forwards. That's not just cutting customer quality, but in a way that's actually using fewer bits in a way that's actually also better for the environment. So the company that I'm working with, iSize, is doing that in a couple of different ways with bitrate reduction and dynamic resolution scaling, which we can get into later.
We are definitely going to get into that. Now, for every OTT question time, I usually do some background reading, so I don't come in completely thick to the conversation. When I started looking at OTT streaming, reading Maria's article, reading Gulliver, you've written an article about this lately as well, Luke, looking at your website, and Lars, reading your recent article on this. When we're talking about the environmental impact of OTT streaming, it really is multifaceted. I mean, we can look at the actual streams itself and about and then go into, as Maria says, bit rates and resolution. We can talk about devices and how they're created, and we can look at the whole glass-to-glass process. We can look at the entire supply chain, if we wanted to, actually, of building, selling, and repairing related hardware. But I think that a good place to start is just to sort of set the scene and understand what the lay of the land is. So the first question, I guess, is how much streaming is actually happening? Yeah, and how has that changed over, let's say, the last 5 years, 10 years, and most recently this year, when we have been at home a lot, yeah, since March. Gulliver, you and I were talking about this earlier this week. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So I've been doing a bit of investigation to this because I'm actually quite intrigued by the eventual shift over to streaming from linear, right? And whether or not that's better or worse for everybody. And so it looks a bit like VOD viewing went up by at least 20% at the start of lockdown, and that was on the Conviva report. So I think you had a Nielsen report in the end of 2019 saying that viewing was up to an hour and 20 minutes a day, or something, an hour and 10 minutes a day, or something like that per consumer in the US. And then I think Conviva took that up by about another 20%. So I think the latest stats I looked at, it's about 91 minutes or something like that per consumer in the US right now. Of streaming, right, versus just over 3 hours of linear TV a day per consumer. But the interesting thing, I think, with the streaming is it did shoot up, and we've seen a massive uptick. And obviously, we talked about in the previous session, there's been a lot of new subscriptions taken out for new services and stuff like that, and it's definitely kind of gaining more and more traction with the longer tail of people that might have been slower to adopt some of these new services or see them. Everyone's got Netflix because everyone talks about it at the water cooler or on the school playground or whatever, and it's a household brand. But some of these smaller services out here, like Acorn, which does all the UK stuff here, or some of the horror movie focused or anime or something like that. Those guys have been picking up quite a lot of subs through the lockdown as well. It looks like it's up about 20%. The thing I can't work out is whether or not that's a little bit because there's been no live sports, right? Because traditionally live sports is largely viewed live on TV, and it has, obviously, the Super Bowl and some of those things have been sliding more towards IP over the years, but I don't know whether it'll slow down a little bit as live sports comes back, or whether or not that really is a step change to a new normal and it carries on growing from there.
Yeah, because Akamai had seen a 30% increase in global traffic in March without the live sports streaming. So yeah, very specifically without it.
Yeah.
And that was an entire year's growth, which is just to put that
exactly. So it's about a year's growth in 3 months or something. I think is whether or not you get a slight dip as sports comes back or not. But I think what we've seen consistently year on year is it is just growing at over 20% every year, right? Yeah.
And Maria, do you want to carry on actually? And in your article, you talked about Netflix consumption and also Disney. Yeah. So you talked about the amount of actual streaming and then what that converted to in terms of energy usage. Yeah, but if you want to do the first bit first, which is how much.
Yeah, so just to sort of frame this in context a bit, Sandvine always comes out with its annual report, and it's normally video is about 60%. Well, it's of all internet traffic, yeah. So, but Sandvine predicted it would have gone up to 70%. So it stayed at 60%, but it would have gone up to 70% if the European Commission hadn't requested this reduction of bit rates. So, and the other thing that happened is all of the traffic suddenly moved onto consumer networks, right? So everything that people were consuming at work and everywhere else. So Sandvine could suddenly measure that. And that suddenly meant that YouTube had nearly 16% of all global traffic, and Netflix actually decreased slightly to about 11.5%. But saying that, overall, the increase was more. It's just we were using fewer bits to deliver it. So for Netflix, standard definition is 0.7 gigabits per hour. So 1.6 megabits per second. HD goes up to about 3 gigabits per hour. And this is what the measure that most people use to sort of run all the calculations is to say, well, maybe it's about on average about 3. And UHD goes up to about 7 gigabytes per hour. And so I was looking at I was trying to run through the calculations for all of this. And I was looking at the numbers. In 2017, Netflix had 117 million subscribers viewing 1 hour, 11 minutes per day. And that's been growing. So now they have 182 million subscribers. And then last year they said they were watching 2 hours per day. But when I started doing the math, that seemed really low, because that came out to be 400 exabytes of data per year. And I know we were talking before about what's an exabyte. Do you want me to do this?
Yeah, so let's do this. Yeah, so hold on. 1,000 bytes is
byte.
1,000 kilobytes is
kilobyte, megabyte, gigabyte, terabyte, petabyte, exabyte. And each of those has 3 zeros after it. Okay. Yeah. So that's, it's a lot of data, but the thing is that they started doing some analysis of how much data Disney was using.
Yeah.
And that was just on mobile traffic. And so they said, oh, well, at the beginning of May, mobile traffic for Disney Plus across North America, Europe, just North America, Europe, reached 7 exabytes per month, but that was only 1.2 to 2.2% of the mobile video traffic. So I was like, okay, well, I'll just kind of run the numbers with that. And I'm like, so that's 480 exabytes per year.
Yeah.
Just for Netflix, because Netflix is at 7 to 15%, and I'm using the lower ranges. I'm using the 1.2 and the 7%.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this doesn't make sense. That's way too low. So I saw somebody had done some research saying that perhaps we were actually now viewing 3.2 hours of video per day. And that comes out to 640 exabytes per year, which still seems low.
Yeah. Now this is exactly, one of the sort of complicating factors here when I was talking to each of you guys individually during the week, and also doing my sort of background reading on this, that, there's philosophical and thought hurdles to overcome, not just in terms of the mathematics and the terminologies, but also the sort of philosophical idea itself of climate change and what that change actually will translate to in practical terms, in real life. Luke, can you tell us about Terra Nutra and how that factors into this conversation?
Sure. So I co-founded Terra Nutra about 9 months ago now, with a friend of mine who has worked in the sustainability sector for the last 12 years. So he brought a lot of the scientific know-how and discipline to the partnership. We started it with a very simple premise, which was that the scientific argument behind climate change is now at a point where it is both credible and widespread. So you still have climate change deniers. However, you now have more scientists, crudely speaking, who say, yes, climate change is happening, and here is the scientific evidence for that, than you have saying, no, we disagree, or we have philosophical differences about this, that, and the other. And coupled with that was a significant increase in general awareness of consumers, of the public, about the issue of climate change. And this was driven by people like Greta Thunberg, by people like Extinction Rebellion, by David Attenborough. There was a dramatic increase in media coverage of, should we say, champions of climate change, or the battle against climate change in the last 18 months. And our premise, which was an optimistic one, was if people could do something about this, if they were properly educated, properly aware, and had tools, information, knowledge at their disposal, they would act positively against climate change. And once you kind of get that, once you basically get that groundswell of not just popular opinion, but popular action, you get real change. And so we wanted to be part of that. And so we set up Terra Nutra to provide to start with the public, individuals, people with some of those tools. And where we started very simply was helping people understand what goes into their carbon footprint, and then helping them understand how they could get that number down. So my carbon footprint 18 months ago was about, it's measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. There's a lot of horrible acronyms that are very inaccessible. There's not much better than megabytes and gigabytes and terabytes and so forth. However, tons of carbon dioxide. Mine was about 16.5. At that point, the average UK's residence was 12.2. I was way over through a process of understanding what was in my carbon footprint, reducing some of it, offsetting some of it. I'm actually down at 9 tons, which is below the average. And then I actually offset all of that anyway, because I'm kind of in that business. So, in summary, the view that we took, and so far I'm happy to say we were right to be optimistic, is that gradually, perhaps too gradually, people are leaning more into the premise that they need to take individual responsibility for their carbon footprint and doing something about it. And that responsibility extends into the products they buy, the services they use, and ultimately the governments that they vote for.
Yeah. And Lars, just finishing off the sort of data piece about this then, in your article, you responded partly to a BBC documentary about streaming and the environmental impact of it, called Dirty Streaming, actually. I will put this in the chat area, a link to this program afterwards as well. Can you sort of tell us about your sort of pushback against that program, coming from the background that you do and being the CEO of Varnish?
Well, I think when we talk about numbers, they're all, I mean, as we already talked about, it's difficult especially for consumers, to get a grasp of exactly what impact my streaming can have on the environment. And I was really pushing back on some of the numbers that were presented that were highly exaggerated. I think it's important that we get the facts right, especially if we're trying to educate ourselves as consumers on how we should behave to limit the impact. So, yeah.
Okay, and one of the numbers in there specifically was about this video called Despacito. Was it Justin Bieber or was it somebody else?
I think it was Justin Bieber. It was when I wrote that, I want to forget all about the article, but I think it was Justin Bieber. That's right.
And what was the quote? It was something like 5 billion. Do you remember it?
No, I can't. Can you help me, please?
Sure. Yeah. So it's 5 billion YouTube streams of that particular video was the equivalent, according to this TV program, of 5 African countries' whole year of electricity consumption.
Yeah.
But you said actually that was exaggerated by about a factor of 200.
Exactly.
Okay. So in that case, I did some maths, and 5 billion streams on YouTube equals 9 days of electricity consumption for one African country, which is still quite a lot, right?
Still a lot.
By the way, incidentally, and as I say, just to sort of finish off the sort of numbers piece here, YouTube now streams apparently in 2019 5 billion streams a day, which, if we're still using this African country, as our benchmark, is 3,331 days of an African country's electricity consumption. That's what YouTube uses in a whole year. Sorry, Gulliver, you were about to say something?
No, I was just digesting the fact stuck in the throat.
And altogether, let's see, the whole internet in 2017 used 1.1 zettabytes. Of.
Yeah, that's over here. That's one after the exabytes.
Can we put this into context then? So, do we know? Well, we know, Luke. What other industries use in terms of their energy consumption and their carbon footprint?
Yeah, so there was a report in 2014, I think, that suggested that the information and communications technology industry actually used 50% more power, or was 50% more power than the aviation industry, and that data centers alone were responsible for 10% of the consumption of globally produced electricity. And that, if you put that into context, means that they create more carbon emissions than aeroplanes do. So on that basis, you would look at video streaming, and we've talked about the percentage of overall internet traffic that is given over to video streaming. Even if it is a proportion of that, which obviously it is still a significant problem, and it would rank, highly in terms of the other verticals, sort of power, transport, manufacturing, and so forth. What's interesting to me is that you would assume that there would be, or rather intuitively, you might say, well, I'm going to say that transport's clearly going to be one of the industries that creates the most emissions, and perhaps manufacturing is going to be one. Where I think where video streaming has an issue is perhaps not the pure numbers of emissions, but the awareness on the part of the public and the consumer of the fact that there are emissions at all. So again, do you do the maths that says, well, if I decide that I'm going to watch an SD version at 1.3 megabits per second, which you wouldn't know because, but that it's going to be lower quality than HD at 3 or UHD, how do you know what is telling you that actually that is going to have a bigger impact in terms of emissions than SD? Yeah. So what signposting how are we helping consumers be aware of the choices that they make, what devices they're watching on? Are they watching on a mobile phone versus an older television LED that is, for instance, less power efficient than an OLED, and many times less power efficient than the one up from OLED, the name of which I can never remember. So I think that, in summary, there is a significant, video streaming has a significant kind of emissions profile, but it perhaps the insidious aspect of that is the lack of understanding on the part of the general public and people who use these services that it is so. They all think, well, we shouldn't fly. We know that's bad. Most people do. We know that's bad for emissions. We know that's bad for the environment. Do they think I probably shouldn't watch, Netflix so much? I shouldn't stream Spotify so much, whatever. And I think the answer to that is no, they don't.
When you figured out that you were using 16 tons of, or you were outputting 16 tons of emissions per year, I assume.
Yeah.
Right, because not even you are that much of a glutton, right? That it would be a month or anything like that. Did you, because you have 2 kids, for example.
Yeah.
What was the mathematics? What was the proportions?
Yeah, so we use, or I use so on the internet you can find lots and lots of carbon footprint calculators. I use the WWF because I like the way that it presents the data. It's obviously a very credible, internationally known and respected organization. And so it goes through and it asks you a series of questions according to 5 categories, one of which is your home use, which would include electricity, internet usage, and things of that nature. But then you've got sort of stuff, which is mobile phones, fridges, televisions. And so the video streaming piece, and obviously we're going to come on and talk about this later, would have some element of crossover between those 2 categories. And in answer to your question, this was purely my carbon footprint. It was possibly less than that because I included a household of 4 people, so that electricity usage was split across 4. However, you can find calculators that will go into a lot more detail. But to be honest with you, for me, because I'm not so interested in numbers as I am in people doing something about those numbers, I'm very happy for it to be a slightly cruder tool than perhaps others available.
By the way, WWF is not wrestling, it is
the World Wildlife Fund. WWE is WWE is wrestling, right?
They've got a lot of WWs, Luke. Don't worry.
WWW is the...
And also, can I just say that I did some measuring on my carbon footprint, and I did it on the house because I live in suburban Los Angeles. and I came out at 60 tons. So
we need to talk about that.
We need to talk about that. That's right. I'm not going to fly anywhere to see if I can offset the air conditioning.
Well, I grew up off grid, so you know, I'm hoping that's offset a chunk of my life.
We're going to come to you, Maria Ingold, the ex-hippie, in just a little bit. Gulliver, can you carry on talking actually about proportions? So cows, for example, methane, from cows digesting their food, is 2%. What is transport? What is aviation? What is
right. So I did a bit of looking at this the other day, and aviation I think is just under 1% of global emissions. Right? It seems to be 0.9 or something. And then I kind of got interested in where we were going with linear versus streaming. And actually, I kind of worked out that if everything flipped to streaming tomorrow on current technology, current emissions, which is 0.4 of a kilo of carbon per hour watched or something like that, according to some Berkeley study. If everything flipped tomorrow, then streaming would be 2% of global emissions. So it would be double aviation, basically, which is bonkers. Now, we know it's going to grow gradually. And we know that there are smart people working on putting in infrastructure, like Lars, for example, right? Caching is a really big deal here, so you don't hit the data center every time. You know, and there are various other things going on in the world. But if we flip tomorrow, it would literally be 2% of global emissions, which is mind-blowing. I think when you, as Luke says, you know, when everyone kind of feels guilty about flying off to Mauritius or whatever on holiday. And actually, you know, if you're just sitting at home watching Netflix, you're doing your bit, as it were, or not doing a bit. But the interesting bit about linear versus streaming, so my number of 91 minutes on streaming was per household per day. And live TV in the US is about 3.5, is about 8 hours. It's 3.5 per person, but it's about 8 hours per household with co-viewing, because there's about 2 to 3 people in each household, right? So the 8 hours of linear and the hour and a half of streaming, if I've got my, hang on, my scratch pad here, if I've got that right, are the linear TV is nearly 5 times as much consumption of actual video, is only is half, hang on, is twice the carbon, right? So basically TV is much more carbon efficient. And so I don't know that you can tell people not to watch Netflix, but to watch TV. Right. But certainly if people consume their sports on TV, that would be a good thing. Linear, traditional TV. So if they consume their sports on broadcast rather than watching it over IP, like on a laptop or streaming it, then that would be a much more carbon friendly or environmentally friendly activity. Definitely.
Lars, can you talk to that for a moment?
Yes, so I think whatever the number is, if it's 0.4 or 0.9 of the carbon emissions, the really concerning things is the growth that we will see. People will not stay on linear TV. We are now about, probably not in Northern Europe because we're a bit late, but in other parts of the world, people are moving into 5G and doing that rapidly. And 5G will change the consumer experience from watching TV dramatically. We are not we're looking at 4K, we're looking at 8K live video, live sports, where you combine perhaps 2, 3, or 4 streams. You have co-viewing mode. You have so many things, and that will increase the data that we will consume dramatically. And that's the real concern, because if the airline industry said that we're going to quadruple our carbon emissions in the next 5 years, people will go crazy. But this is exactly what's going to happen in the streaming industry unless we do something about it and create something that is much more clever.
Right.
Because people will absolutely want these services, and we have to produce them in a more sustainable way.
And where does caching come into the mix here?
So basically the way that we and others see caching software is that caching should actually happen inside the 5G networks themselves. And that will probably happen because as soon as consumers have had the 5G experience, there's no way that they're going to go back to the old internet that is slow and very inefficient. So that will be a big shift for the CDN industry. But the good thing about the 5G infrastructure is that it will be more energy efficient. So for every new generation of mobile phone networks have reduced energy efficiency with approximately 10 times. So we can expect 5G to be 10 times more energy efficient than 4G, and that's good news. Some people are even saying that we can get up to 20 times more efficient on energy, because 5G networks are constructed to include stuff like sleep mode. So you won't have to have millions or hundreds of thousands of servers running idle. When they're not used, they won't consume any efficiency. And things like that actually give some hope for the future, to be able to provide better customer experience, but at the same time reduce carbon emissions and energy consumption.
As a slight digression, since you're talking about 5G actually as well, am I right in thinking that when 5G is widely available enough and resilient and stable enough as well, that actually in homes we won't need to have our own individual Wi-Fi networks anymore, our own dedicated Wi-Fi networks?
Exactly.
Okay, so there is a knock-on effect, a good effect there.
I'm sure that will happen. Yes.
Okay.
And if we build the infrastructure right, we could probably get away with using less energy than we're doing today.
Okay. Even though 5G has an issue going through walls, through buildings.
Yes.
Okay.
That's really for the millimeter band, for the special frequencies that we will have in the cities. We will be able to use 5G at home.
Okay.
Yeah.
And even though in the UK, particularly this week, now that we're dumping Huawei, apparently, so we're going to be three years behind in 5G.
Koza, don't you have to wear a mask when you're using 5G? Is that what I heard?
Let's all go about that mask.
Yeah.
Maria, the stage is set for bytes and data consumption.
Oh gosh.
You were talking about. So, I mean, we're now talking about how to ameliorate things, how to make things better. Yeah. So, how do bytes and screen resolution affect that?
Well, there's so much I've been thinking about as we've been talking, because some of the numbers that other people have been coming up with are different to the numbers that I've been seeing.
Right.
So I know that and you were talking about this as well, I know that there's a whole series of debate, like, the shift projects analysis versus the George Kamaya from the International Energy Agency. The differences in the scales are completely different. So you really have to be careful when you're looking at the numbers here to figure out what's valid. Because some of the things I've seen is that data centers are using 1% of global electricity, and then the transmission networks, which are transmitting the bits of data, are using about 1.1% of the global electricity. Those are 2018 numbers, just to be clear.
Right.
When you say transmission, do you mean like linear TV, or do you mean the actual distribution of bits and bytes over the internet?
That one, second one.
Okay. So that's the one that Mars is trying to help with, right?
Yeah. So
and ACMI and various other.
Yeah. So there's a few different things. So we were talking about there's two different ways that we can help. One is on industry side and one is on consumer side. We've talked a bit about the consumer side. There's things like just recalling on that a 50-inch LED TV consumes 5 times the electricity of a laptop, but 100 times that of a smartphone. And Luke, the thing you were looking for was micro LED. So micro LED is more efficient than OLED, more efficient than LED backlit LCD, more efficient than plasma. And newer devices are more efficient than older devices, but there's also production costs to consider in there. So producing an iPhone is 79% of its carbon emissions, iPhone 11. So there's a number of things like that. And then Wi-Fi, we were having a discussion about 5G. It looks to me like those numbers still tend to be more efficient than 5G, but I still need to run the math through all of that. It's certainly more efficient than 4G. So all those types of things are the things that, like what Luke is talking about, that we need to educate consumers about. And so they can make those decisions and trade-offs and consume consciously.
And part of the difficulty here is agreeing standards, right?
Well, that's another side. So it depends where you're taking the standards. So if we're looking at codecs,
Yeah.
for instance, so coming back to what we do as industry,
Yeah.
we have all these different codecs, and the ones that are most ubiquitous also take up the most bytes. So H.264 is most ubiquitous. It's across most devices and platforms, but it's not as good at reducing the number of bits. And you've got then H.265 or HEVC, which has like a 25 to 50% bit rate reduction on H.264, and AV1, which is better than that. It's not as good for all bit rate ladders, but it's much better for things like ultra high definition, where it can get up to 43% improvement over H.265.
Yeah.
But it's 50 to 3,000 times slower. So even though people are doing things to sort of address that, like multi-dimensional parallelism across many CPUs, so you need to look at other ways. So there's things like during encoding, which is what Netflix did with per title encoding back in 2015.
Yeah.
And created VMAF, which is a perceptual measurement that allows us to figure out how it looks versus how it matches the original. So a lot of the original measurements were about how does it match the original. And that's coming up with these kinds of perceptual measurements have allowed us to do things like, prior to encoding, reverse engineering things. So you can figure out how do we enhance this image to reduce the bits but make it look better. And that's the kind of thing that iSize is doing. So that's pre-coding or pre-processing. But then you can also, prior to putting it to the encoder, is make the encoder not have to work as hard. So if you're not ready to use a new codec yet, but you still want to get something that's more efficient, you can do something like dynamic resolution scaling, which is intelligently downscaling what you're sending to the encoder.
Yeah.
So if you have a whole image here and you say, okay, I'm going to cut it in half horizontally and in half vertically, and you're just using a quarter of that image, you've still got the same data rate. So you've got more bits representing each pixel, but so you can get good quality for that, but the encoder doesn't have to work as hard. And you can analyze per frame which resolution will give you the optimal result.
Now,
so that's another thing that's being used.
Yes, and you can understand why. I mean, it's a fascinating conversation, yeah. And the CTOs amongst us,
yeah,
and the engineers, yeah, and the programmers would be absolutely most interested in that conversation. Yeah. You can understand how CMOs, COOs would be slightly less engaged, yeah, with that.
So it's gonna save the amount of energy that you're using, which is gonna reduce your costs. So if you're doing something with YouTube and you've got a billion views, for instance, then, and if you're spending sort of $1 billion per year and you cut out 25% of those bits, then you're saving yourself $250 million a year. So,
obviously,
so on the money side, it can save you money by doing that. And then on the energy efficiency side, of course, that will also then help save the environment as well.
But I think Koza, the issue with that is that it's very straightforward to say this will have a bottom line impact on your electricity usage, right? So you will get a smaller bill if your bill reflects electricity, right? But there are some issues in the chain where either you're not responsible for the manufacturing of an iPhone, right? If you're Netflix, so you don't care about that. Or there may be other areas of the chain where, say, Amazon or one of the other cloud providers might be presenting you bills in ways which disguise your usage because actually they don't want you to measure it on usage, because then they have to turn some servers off, which means they make less money, right? So that transparency in the supply chain and transparency in billing is going to be a really big issue going forward, I think. Just like as Maria says, getting some consistency, and there's the old engineers joke about the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, but actually narrowing down some consistency in apples to apples measurement, and then pushing that through your supply chain as a organization that is responsible for entertaining people using IP delivered video, right? Be TikTok or whoever, right? Doesn't matter. Point is, as an organization, you do within yourself, you can't just put it on the electricity bill. You have to take some responsibility for your supply chain, right? And making sure that everyone that you're working with shares those values. And so part of the change it'll be a shared value change, right? And I think that's what consumers will recognize eventually. They'll say, oh, these companies share my values, and within these companies, they also enforce that with the companies they work with. This is a good thing, right?
And even at the most basic level, when it comes to standards, I mean, you can't. Every device has its own charger. Yeah. And they're different types of chargers. Yeah. So they're sort of not universal, and that alone would be, from a consumer perspective, a sort of massive carbon emission saving as well. We've already been talking for 41 minutes. We'll go on a little longer than 1:45 this time. If anybody has questions, then please send them through in the chat area or in the Q&A as well. I have still got more questions. The last bit, I guess, of the questions I have is to figure out what we can do next. What we can do better too, from both an industry and a consumer perspective to well, minimize might be the wrong word, but at least be more mindful of OTT streaming emissions. Luke, do you want to get into this?
Yeah, sure. So echoing points that all of the other panelists have made. For me, there are two things that we can do as part of the industry, and also as consumers. The first thing as part of the industry is actually sort of speaking to what Gulliver said, which is you have to look at this as an end-to-end process. So the moment that you start saying, well, that bit isn't my responsibility and that bit is, you will get into arguments about whose responsibility it is, and there will be grey areas and nobody will do anything about it. And so in slightly cliched terms, we do need each piece of that chain that starts with the production of a piece of content and ends in the device and the network by which that content is delivered to the consumer, to agree that this is a problem that we all need to work together to solve. And it's interesting to note that if you take a company like Netflix or any other, and you look at their emissions in the round, up to 80% of those emissions, to Gulliver's point, will be in their supply chain. So if you just say to a company, we need you to be responsible for your emissions, they can say, okay, fine, I'll do that. And a huge chunk of those will sort of fall through the cracks. And so we absolutely need each part of that chain to agree that collectively we need to do something about it. And I 100% agree with what Gulliver said, which is that the more often companies go to their suppliers and say, we are now measuring this, we're measuring our emissions, which means we're measuring your emissions, you're putting somebody on notice that this is important to you. If they're not measuring it, they need to. If they are measuring it, they're going to need to reduce it. And you're effectively saying, this is now a buying criterion for us. And so I think more rigorous application of that kind of procurement process is critical. I think from an end consumer perspective, standards are great, but we all know that they take quite a long time to agree on. I would love to see us start to introduce some signposting, some labeling, some attractive iconography that helps consumers understand that watching X hours of this or Y hours of that does have an environmental impact, and that there is a more environmentally responsible, more sustainable method of consumption available to them. And you know, whether that is looking at different types of subscription package, whether it's looking at different types of labeling. You know, you've got, I think it's called, is it called George, the standard of the production standard in the UK, and you see programs that now say, you know, this is made according to George. I think George is wrong, actually, and I'm not sure where I got that from. But you know, that as that becomes
the clothing brand,
yeah, as more, you know, as people become more aware of what those labels mean,
yeah,
will start to inform their viewing choices. So I would love to see us start to put that sort of information into you know, into the public's hands, into consumers' hands, and letting them sort of lead with their feet, as it were.
Lars, is there? You talked about this as well, actually, in your last article about the Swedish concept of. Oh my God, I'm going to totally screw this up. Is it Flydskam? You're on mute, Lars.
Yes, you're right. The Swedish word is flygskam. It's being ashamed for taking a flight.
Right.
Yeah.
And is there an opportunity here for our industry, for OTT, to take a lead? Yeah, because I mean, in terms of labeling, Luke, when you take a flight, they don't tell you what your emissions are. Yeah. When you buy eggs at the supermarket, they don't tell you what your emissions are there either. Yeah. Is any industry actually doing that?
So you were often given the opportunity to make a contribution to offsetting the cost of your flight with some airlines. So BA have been doing it for a while. So in some industries, the answer is yes. And actually, we are working with a number of companies who are looking at doing exactly that and saying, okay, this is the carbon cost of this item.
Yeah.
You're now aware of it. You may now choose to do something with it. Sorry, Lars.
Yeah, sorry, Lars, go for it.
No, that's fine. No, but I agree with what Luke said earlier. I do think that power consumption and emissions should be sort of KPIs that are used when procuring new hardware or new infrastructure. And I think it will happen because the cost of electricity, and especially green electricity, clean electricity, will increase, especially with the all new electrical cars. That will be very expensive. So I'm quite sure that will happen in a couple of years from now. Everyone will be more aware, and also the fact that if you can reduce your consumption and you can use less servers or whatever, that will certainly help your return on investment. So I think that's the next step.
I mean, do you think that it would be as explicit as when you're about to stream an episode of what's most recent, The Sinner on Netflix, that it will tell you at the beginning of the program that we noticed that you're watching this on a mobile phone, and this 45-minute show will use up approximately X of energy and output this much carbon. Is that likely?
No, I don't think so. I think there's an industry problem that have to be dealt with separately, and I think that will happen because of it will be more profitable to actually consume less power and use less equipment to produce the same amount of streaming. But what I'm concerned about is the mobile devices. I mean, if you watch the young generation growing up, they watch most of their videos and streaming services on their mobile. They do that all the time. And we currently have approximately 5 billion mobile phones in the world. 2.5 billion of them are what we call smartphones. And if they're replaced every second year, that's going to have a big impact on the environment.
Right.
All the important metals and minerals that are required. So I think we will have to, I hope that we're able to see a mobile telephone manufacturer that will create a mobile phone that are sustainable, that you perhaps can use for 5 or 10 years, that may be sold on a subscription, which would be profitable for the mobile vendor, because they can make sure that we can reuse and upgrade the device with different parts over time. And I think that would also appeal to, I'm sure, a part of the younger generation who are not big fans of wear and tear. So that's what I would like to see, because 5 billion devices, it's a lot.
Has Apple...
It makes sense. It's kind of how Tesla are going as well, isn't it? You know, they're selling these cars that will do 1 million miles, and then they're starting to layer on subscriptions within the ownership.
exactly.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to ask is whether do we know whether Apple has removed planned obsolescence from its products? Because it used to build that in as a sort of philosophy, didn't it? That you could only charge a phone, 8,000 times before the battery started diminishing in terms of performance. No, all right, fine. I'll find out more about that. Maria, there was a question for you in the chat area. Did you see it?
No.
So the question is from Alison Simmons. Well, it says to all panelists, but Maria mentioned an EU legislation that asks for the reduction of bit rates. What other policies, movements are there that are creating environmental protection in streaming and energy to protect natural capital?
This was a short-term request, and they have all returned to their normal bit rates, which means that places like Netflix have actually quadrupled their capacity in ISPs. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily helping. It's more right now. There are more individuals who are trying to do things. So you'll get places like Limelight who are replacing their infrastructure with next generation server hardware and software that uses less energy, so they can deliver more megabits per watt. And they're selecting data centers based on access to renewable energy. Yeah, Netflix is ensuring that 100% of its estimated direct and indirect non-renewable power is matched by renewable energy certificates and carbon offsets. But this is an individual thing. I'm not seeing sort of anything particularly long-term.
Yeah. I think this is a good, well, no, we've got one more question. I was going to say, this is a good place to leave it with lots of food for thought. But Alison actually is not asking another question. She's just saying thank you. So it is a good place to end this conversation. We will talk about this again, I suspect, because this issue is not going away, and we're not going to save the world inside a 50-minute panel. If indeed we are at all, because what are we? None of us are boomers, right? We're at least Gen X. Gulliver?
I'm Gen X.
Yes, I'm Gen X. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to thank my panelists in order that I can see them, to Luke of Terra Nutra, Gulliver of Ramprate, Maria Gold of My Reality, and Lars Larsen of Varnish Software. Next week, we are going to talk about UI and UX in OTT services, and I'm asking the question about whether UI is basically now settled. A lot of UIs are based on grids. They all look pretty familiar. Is anybody experimenting? And that's what we're going to chat about. Thank you very much. The video will be available from Monday. Cheers.